All right. Well, first of all, I just want to say thank you for asking me to lead this panel discussion. I'm very honored, and I'm really excited to have these three special guests with me today. So our session is going to be on the importance of using gamification in your training. It's going to be a little bit different than a normal presentation in that we're going to have our guest speakers share their insights. And before we get going, I just wanted to share a stat. So this is a study that we recently conducted using our Training Arcade platform with 2,500 games in the platform. And what we found is that games can really boost knowledge retention. So the fact that games are fun, which is a little bit different than taking a quiz, people tend to be more likely to play a game more than one time if they're not, super pleased with their score, their position on the leaderboard. So what we found was that there's a significant increase in knowledge from the first to the third time that somebody played, upwards of 58%. And that's again because games have that replayability factor, they're fun, they're competitive. We also found that players on average were playing 1.7 times per session, and there was 58% of them were coming back 3 times. So, on somebody's own free will, they don't typically come back to you and say, hey, may I please take that training? But they're more likely to hit play again when it comes to a game. So knowledge retention is really a big deal when it comes to games, and that's part of what we're going to talk about today. Okay. Moving on. So for the overview today, I just wanted to let everybody know what to expect from our session. So our panelists are going to talk about how they're using games and gamification to activate and educate learners. They're going to share some of their favorite approaches, some programs that they've recently worked on, some outcomes, potentially some data. And so we're going to get going, in just a second, but I'm going to start off by just introducing myself and our panelists, and then going through a few slides before we get into the meat of the presentation. So once again, I'm Jaime McDonald. Nice to meet everybody I haven't met before. I'm the EVP of Customer Success at the Game Agency, which is the game division of ELB Learning. I've been with the company for 7.5 years and consider myself somewhat of a game specialist with our Training Arcade platform. So these are our 3 panelists, and just for the sake of time, I thought I would read a little blurb about each of them. So let's start with Laura Engles-Horton, who I've been working with for the last 4 years. Laura is the Director of Medical Affairs Training in U.S. Learning and Development at Bayer Pharmaceuticals. She's based in New Jersey. And Laura spent many years training healthcare professionals from her role as a clinical coordinator at Yale New Haven Hospital in Connecticut, to her role providing training for MSLs, medical science liaisons. Laura recently developed a digital skills training platform to provide MSL skills training content on demand. And that includes all pull-through activities that she has used with the Training Arcade. And she's going to get into the details a bit more as we go through some of these questions. So then we have Trisha Sackman. Trisha and I have been working together for just over a year. She's the onboarding leader at GE Healthcare, based in Mount Pleasant, Wisconsin. Trisha has been with GE Healthcare for almost 5 years. She graduated from Texas Tech University in 2022 with a master's in strategic communication and innovation. Trisha is going to share more about a project that she also used the Training Arcade for to convert a 5-day in-person training to a robust self-paced learning using gamification. Trisha's skills of creativity, content creation, attention to detail, strategic planning all contribute to her success at GE. And on a personal note, Trisha recently volunteered for the World Games Special Olympics in Berlin, Germany. And now we have Todd Billingsley, who I have known for the last few years. Todd and I met when he was at Boehringer Ingelheim. But Todd is based in Atlanta. He's a partner and founder at Framework Leadership. Framework is a leadership development company focused on helping companies identify, develop, and build strong leaders. Framework has built immersive programs for both emerging first and second line leaders. And Todd's experience spans over 25 years as a leader, 10 of those in the L&D leadership, both domestically and globally. He's built leadership programs that have blended traditional approaches with immersive programs. And that includes things like gamification, simulations, VR, and AR. So we're going to get more into that. Welcome, speakers. Thank you again for your time and participating today. All right, so why are we all here and what do we have in common? So what I have in common with the three of you is that we have all started our relationship based on games and gamification, and you have all seen firsthand how that has been a nice complement to all of the learning and leadership development and training opportunities that you've been involved with. So for anyone who's not familiar with the Training Arcade, this is a platform that launched in 2017. It is a do-it-yourself games and game authoring platform. It has a library of 10 games with an 11th game coming out shortly, where it will be announcing that soon. And the idea is that this is a really easy tool for companies to use to plug your own learning content into these games and then have the flexibility to deploy the games anywhere. You can deploy games in your LMS and as links, and you can deploy them as instructor-led training events and all that. So we're going to get into that a bit more. And if anyone has questions, certainly let us know in the chat. One of the things that I often hear people do when they're talking about games and gamification is they kind of jumble the two together. So I thought I would just take a second to define the difference between at least how we see games and gamification. When you're playing a game, you're really immersed in that experience and you're focused in the task at hand. You can't do really anything else while you're playing. So games really act as the vehicle for the learning. They're fun and they're, competitive, and they also help collect a lot of rich information so that you can track the effectiveness of learning. And then there's the gamification, which is kind of, all about getting people excited to want to learn and get them to spend time with your content because it's intrinsically and extrinsically rewarding them. And those things that people tend to get excited about, and the reason why they want to keep coming back to your content is because they're going to be earning prizes and points and badges and leaderboards and all of those things that get them excited to be more competitive. Now, when you think about games, they're not just for fun. Games really do drive, earlier when I talked about the data, they drive a ton of knowledge retention. A lot of times when I'm on a call with someone for the first time, they mention that engagement is a really big part. Hey, how do I get my people to really want to spend more time with my content? I'm throwing a lot of material at them. I really want to make this more fun and engaging. Often competition gets built into that. Games can be really collaborative. People can play games alone, but when you bring in the element of teams playing against each other and make it more of a learning experience, or when people are collaborating more, that's an important element to learning. And so games do help build that level of community. They change behaviors. Often when someone feels more confident in their job because they've played games that reinforce the material, it gets them to be more productive. And therefore that could mean bringing in more sales or just being more successful in general. And then being able to track everything and measure the performance from an individual perspective, or both, from across, the aggregate. If you had 100 people playing a game and you notice that, 80 of them missed a particular question, that data is going to be really key in helping you understand where there might be some gaps so you can go back and, course correct. Now, I'm going to talk about the when, why, and where using games, and then we're going to get into, having this panel discussion. But if you think about games and adding them to your strategy, they really can be used anywhere. So, Trisha comes from the world of onboarding, and using games to onboard employees is something that, I hear a lot. It's a great way when you're throwing a lot of important material at a new hire for them to absorb the content better. But if you're doing anything in soft skills, hard skills, leadership development, teaching people how to overcome objections, really important, yearly compliance training or safety, just think about that games can really add a nice element to any of those strategies. Why you might want to use a gamified strategy. Again, this comes down to reinforcement and assessing information, but it also could be a great way to teach terminology, to tell a great story, to get people to remember things, to help them problem solve, and to really motivate them. Where to use games. So think about, at least with our platform, we wanted to make it flexible so that you literally could use games anywhere. So if it's asynchronous e-learning that's happening by the individuals by themselves inside of your LMS, you can do that. If you've got, if you typically are using Teams or Zoom or WebEx or any other virtual platform, and you want to have teams collaborating in breakout sessions, or if you're in person and you want groups of people to be playing together. So team play is really important. Instructor-led games are really exciting because, again, that allows somebody on your team to kind of control the pace of the learning experience, but make it more fun and engaging and have everybody participating. Blending all of these things together, of course, is really important. And then don't forget about your meetings, whether it's a tiny meeting with 5 or 10 people, or it's a giant sales training meeting with 500 or thousands of people. Just know that you can use games, across any of those, different types of environments. All right, so just to kick things off in a fun way, I thought it would be helpful to bring us all back to our childhood, or maybe to present day, and get to know our speakers a little bit more. So Todd, since you're at the top of my photos of everybody on Zoom right now, do you want to let us know what was your favorite kid, either as a game as a kid or now?
Well, you know what? I'm a little bit old school, Jamie, so I wasn't in the age of Sega, but I was there with Atari, and Pong was actually launched when I was a kid, but that was not my favorite game. It was definitely Monopoly. Monopoly's a classic. You got out the whole family together, so I'd have to say Monopoly, Jamie, was my favorite game.
Awesome. I love Monopoly. Actually, a fun fact, the game agency worked with Hasbro, I would probably say maybe 10 years ago, and we built the first digital version of Monopoly where people could actually take their mobile phones, and instead of picking a the community chest cards, they could actually use their mobile phones to challenge one of the other people to a mini game. And then when the money was changing hands, instead of it being paper money, oh gosh, I'm going to forget what we called it, but there was a way that the money could be transferred from one person's device.
So you guys developed the first digital currency used for Monopoly.
There you go. Exactly. Awesome. Thank you, Todd. All right, Laura, how about you next?
I would say Clue was my favorite game as a kid. Being always a science nerd, and just having to figure out who did what where, and based on the information you had. Now I've evolved thanks to my son, and there's a really cool new Star Wars board game that also takes hours and hours that we play, because he's a real Star Wars fan.
Oh, that's awesome. And if you think about Clue, you look now at like all the escape the rooms that are out there and the virtual escape rooms that people create. We have a game in our platform called Detective that was kind of based on the idea of Clue. So, those original board games that everybody still loves and are really nostalgic really do help influence a lot of some of the game ideas that come out today. Okay, Trisha, you're next.
All right, I am obsessed with Monopoly Go. So it is on your phone, it's digital, super interactive game. You can connect with like your friends list, and you create boards, which are like your different levels, and you can like shut down other people's boards and attack them with a crane. It's super fun. And then I've never had to put any money into it, and I'm very proud of that because a lot of these apps you have to pay for. So I've been able to get pretty far without having to put any money into it.
That's awesome. That's like me when I play Candy Crush. I refuse to pay, so I just keep kind of going, and I'll come back later if I have to. So awesome. Well, thank you all for sharing that. So now to get to the meat of the content, obviously we're here today to talk about what your experiences are using games and gamification. So I think the first thing that would help our audience would be to understand who are the audiences that you are, each individually working with or have worked with, and what are the skills that you're typically trying to improve or develop? Trisha, you want to start?
Sure. So my audience is new people to the company, to GE Healthcare. They are service engineers, so they're working on medical equipment. At one time, I have about 25 to 60 users in the training arcade. And we're focusing on like critical thinking, self-management, retention of information is huge, and then collaboration and networking.
Awesome. Thank you, Trisha. Laura, how about you?
So I provide skills and therapeutic area or scientific content training for a team of just over 120 medical science liaisons at Bayer. So from cardiovascular, renal to oncology to cardiopulmonary to hematology. So the skills training that we focus on is, from thought leader engagement. We find, especially currently, many of our new MSLs don't have MSL experience before. They're coming from clinical practice. So, sort of starting at the basics to build their skills, but we expand on that to, basic listening skills, to more specific skills to Bayer that they need to know, like compliance, specific scenarios, legal scenarios. How do you apply certain SOPs that are important for the MSLs to know in their field role?
Oh, that's fantastic. And I forgot to mention, if the audience hasn't figured it out, these are all life science panelists. I happen to work with a lot of companies in the healthcare space, and I thought that it made a lot of sense to kind of, not that our platform and games and gamification don't extend to all industries, because they absolutely do, but for anyone in healthcare, having kind of different areas of the space, our panelists come from different spots, can really add a lot of great value. So thank you, Laura. Todd.
So Jaime, can you hear me? My headphones are so good. I'm kind of sitting in a restaurant as I travel back home. Yeah, so I work with leaders in leadership development. I work with emerging and current and aspiring leaders teams and second line leaders. So what we're working on are really soft skills, what we like to call power skills. Emotional intelligence, diversity, inclusion, and equity. Things about, as Trish pointed out, critical thinking skills, decision making. So those are the types of things that we have been building out scenarios, whether they're in a gamified platform or in AR, VR. So that's kind of the skills. And my leaders are global in nature, so they're either here domestically in the United States, or I work with people across the globe as well to work on these skills and develop these leadership competencies.
That's awesome. Yeah, you know what I found? A lot of times when it comes to companies, individuals who are learning the job, or they're overcoming objections, or they're faced with having to navigate hard conversations or manage people who are doing that, it's very scary. And games allow you to fail safely. They allow you to practice, they allow you to kind of redo the experience. If you don't do well the first time around, they can kind of course correct. And more importantly, even games provide great feedback. So if somebody answers a question correctly, rather than just telling them, yep, that was right, or no, that wasn't right, they allow you to really give significant rationale about why that was or was not a good answer, so that they can kind of learn as they go. Some games are built where you give people one shot, but other games, depending on what you need, can really help guide the learner down the path, so that by the time they get to the end of the game, they actually do know the information, or they can go about playing a game a second time. So I love the idea that you're all using games in that capacity, which makes people feel more comfortable about their job. Okay, so let's move on to some experiences. I know that each of you have some examples that you're looking to share. So maybe we'll just start from the same order we had before. Trisha, you alluded a bit earlier about your program using the training arcade. Do you want to share a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so we use the training arcade specifically on like the core values, because it's like a welcome to GE. And so like the main goal was like, how can I get the audience to retain, right? Like it's so much information. It's a lot, and it's very important information, but like, how can I get them to retain it? And through games, I was able to make that a little bit less overwhelming for them. And it's more engaging. Like before it was just straight, like lecture style, I guess you could say. And now it's more of like this self-paced journey, and they're playing games to remember it all. It's a better atmosphere, I would say. And the competing as an option, having that, I get some very competitive employees. And I've actually, I do it for prizes. And so if they're super competitive, I have to award more than one person because they're just doing all-star in the training arcade.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. I mean, you're basically saying that you're taking what used to be passive learning and turning it into more active learning and getting people really excited. And of course, when you throw in, you know, the level of prizes, which, you know, people worry that, hey, I can't afford a budget that would allow me to put prizes in, but prizes could be anything, right? It could be recognition. It could be lunch with the boss, you know, time off, or whatever the case might be. So whatever, you know, anyone in the audience, if you're thinking about how do I add that extra layer to it without it costing, you know, me and having to go back and get budget, just think about like, what is effective and meaningful to your audience.
Yeah.
So-
And I would say I use like swag. So everybody wants swag.
Exactly. That's awesome. All right, great. Thank you so much, Trisha. How about your experiences, Laura?
So the first time I used the training arcade was actually at our first team meeting of our new cardiorenal MSLs about 3 years ago. So it was our first in-person meeting. And we actually used Jeopardy during the general session. So, you know, we were presenting a lot of scientific content. So it allowed us to gauge their understanding of that and know where we needed to reinforce or provide some additional explanation. But it was also great for team building because we had the group divided into teams and just found it very, very engaging. The feedback from the MSLs was very positive. And then as we did ongoing trainings, they were all virtual because shortly after that first in-person meeting, we all went on lockdown during COVID the next spring. So we would do usually every other week training webcasts or Zoom meetings, which, as you know, we all quickly experienced Zoom fatigue during that time. And so I would start building in games during those training sessions. So Jeopardy often, or quiz or Wheel of Fortune to keep them engaged. Again, one of the most valuable parts of that to me is seeing how they answer. You know where you need to dig a little deeper in presenting the content or explain something more clearly or do follow-up training.
Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, that was definitely a goal that our company had when, you know, a lot of our games that were used for instructor-led training were designed and used prior to the pandemic. But once everybody went remote, we definitely, you know, put in some time to upgrade the software so that it could accommodate remote. So, you know, you could have dozens or hundreds of people playing a game at the same time. And like you said, Laura, when people are, you know, for those of you who don't know, Jeopardy and Wheel of Fortune are two games where we have the official licensed intellectual property. So when we were building out those games, because we had the license and we were building them in partnership with Sony, and they needed to have their input every step of the way as we wanted it to look and feel and act like the game shows that people know, it was really important that we changed one feature. You know, if you remember on TV, you have three people standing up at the podium on Jeopardy, and the first person who buzzes in answers. Well, we made one strategic change, which was, let's not have one person answer. Let's have every single person who's participating in those instructor-led games answer every question. And then what happens is the host of the game, like you experienced, can see exactly how every single person responded. And it tallies the results. So if you have 50 people playing a game and 48 of them got a question wrong, that would immediately allow the host of the game to say, all right, hang on a second, you know, too many of you got that wrong. We need to take a pause, discuss this, make sure you all really understand what the correct answer should have been before moving on. So, so absolutely, it sounds like that was really beneficial for you to not only, you know, engage people who are all working remotely, drive home the content, but also understand what was working and what wasn't. So thank you for sharing that. Awesome. All right, Todd.
All right, so hopefully everybody can hear me. I know my microphone's a little low, but I'm trying my best to articulate as clearly as possible. So yeah, like many of the panelists discussed, I've used scenarios, and I love scenarios because I love branching logic. I love the idea of really best, good, and not so good answers from a branching logic standpoint, especially when it comes around things like emotional intelligence or making decisions based on strategic opportunities or tactical utilization of a strategy from a leadership standpoint, are things that we've built, Jaime, quite often. So when we build out scenarios, or we also use detective, we're using things like situational leadership. Can they diagnose a development level and match the right leadership style in this given scenario? If it's an emotional intelligence scenario, are they identifying the key things that are going on from an emotional intelligence standpoint, and then choosing the right way to respond to it? And through branching logic and scenarios, it helps us kind of determine how people are making decisions, where we need to lean in terms of our knowledge and helping them understand the different scenarios they're going to be in, and then hopefully building up their skills, but also identifying skills and identifying gaps in their ability to discern accurately diagnosing level or emotional intelligence in terms of the situation or scenario. So that really helps us kind of determine where to go next with them and build individual training components for these individual leaders.
And when you were using scenarios game, I mean, one of the great things about the platform is that it can let you see each choice they make, and they not only for the learner themselves, for them to be able to go back and course correct, but for you to see, hey, what was their thought process as they were making these choices and going down different paths.
Yeah,
that's
and how
awesome.
often did they miss a certain scenario based on a emotional intelligence trigger or on a diagnosis trigger? Were they missing areas where they needed to provide more direction and support from a situational leadership standpoint, or from an emotional intelligence standpoint? Were they missing social relationship or social awareness key or triggers? So that, yeah, to your point, it really gave us some really good insight into where we needed to go.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, I appreciate you all sharing those examples, and I'm sure that the audience wants to dig in a little bit further. So now that you've shared what those experiences were, can you share a little bit more about how did your learners actually respond? You know, I know we talked about you were able to see the data and all that, but did you get positive feedback? Were there, were there ways that you saw your team grow? Did their responses equate to, you know, maybe being able to see how they performed in the future a couple months down the road from there? So I don't know, we can work backwards. Todd, do you want to, since you were just talking, do you want to maybe take that?
Yeah, I'd definitely love to start. Well, people love gamification. I think, you know, as you pointed out so accurately, games and gamification, it's a learning journey. And I think people love to learn in the flow of work. Games help people learn in the flow of work. And it also is a measurement tool for us to help them learn in the flow of work. So, yeah, I mean, the feedback that we've gotten from using games, gamification, simulation scenarios within our leadership programs, it's been a huge thumbs up, because it's, you know, again, if learning is a journey, using different tools to help learners across that journey is important to keep them engaged. And so I love how gamification has grown, how the use of AR and VR and different simulations have grown from a learning standpoint, and excited to see what's next. So thumbs up across the board from Behringer and for Biohaven.
Awesome. Thank you for that. That's great to hear. Laura, how about your feedback or learner responses?
So I'll just use our remote, Zoom trainings as an example. So once we still are mainly remote for MSL training because they're spread across the country. Yep. But at that time, we were all learning the science of our new product in the therapeutic area. So inflammation and fibrosis and kidney disease, which is quite a heavy scientific lift of a topic, especially if you're learning it new. And so we often have thought leaders present on our MSL training. And again, really digging down into the science. So I often use trivia or like the quiz game during those trainings, so we could pause and see, how much they had picked up, or if there was a part, a certain topic that we needed to drill down to a little more while we had the thought leader on the phone. And then I also just wanted to share, I'm actually now working on an arcades for our MSL skills training program. And so that's for all of our new hire MSLs, again, whether they've been an MSL or not. So skills for being an MSL, MSL excellence, but things they need to know at Bayer. So I'm working on an arcade to pull that through. And that'll cover, that program right now is 2 half days of training for new MSLs that have been at Bayer about 3 to 6 months. So we have like a knowledge check we do afterwards now, so we get some sense, but with our subscription this year, that's my goal, is to get an arcades built out to continue to pull that knowledge through and let us continue to, know where we need to provide additional training. And then I wanted to also share, so we also have a new cardiovascular renal commercial team at Bayer that's been in place a little over a year now. But we had our first in-person national business meeting in January for all of those reps in the MSLs. So my commercial training colleagues actually built an arcade to pull through the NBM training, the National Business Meeting training. And they had, so it was about over 500 reps. They had, it was like 84% engagement.
Wow.
Of those reps were highly engaged. And then the proficiency increase from pre to post National Business Meeting was around 10%, a little over 10%. So I'm going to use their report from their metrics as a model for me going forward, so we can look at that, within our L&D department as well. But I think they really knocked it out of the park. I'm sure with Jaime's help, putting together what metrics they wanted to look at. So
that's awesome, Laura. Thank you so much. And for anyone who's not familiar with what Laura was talking about with arcades is the part of the training arcade that allows you to build out learning journeys and put a lot of different important content in there so that the learners can keep coming back to it, but the entire experience is gamified. So it's great to hear that your colleagues had such great success and that you're going to kind of try to in a way mimic what they did, and thank you for sharing all those great details. Appreciate that. All right, Trisha, how about
Yes,
your audience?
absolutely. So to kind of emphasize more on that arcade process, it is super awesome. So like you have this arcade, right? And in the arcade, you have these journeys and you can create missions, and the journeys are more like this longer step-by-step process. And a mission is kind of more like focused on one thing. With steps involved in that. And we heavily use this process. The games can be included in that, but I just absolutely love this structure, and so do the new employees, because it's a lot that we're throwing at them when they're first coming to a company, and structure is really important, and they want to know when does this need to be done, where's my priority. And so that absolutely helps this process be a more smoother transaction between us and them. But some of the feedback I've received is that it's fun, it's interactive, it was immersive, and it helped them learn and understand the content. It was better than just listening to PowerPoints and reading policies, because there's videos involved and there's games involved. So we get really good feedback. I really haven't received any negative feedback besides those who just are absolutely against gamification and just want a checklist.
Well, you're always going to find that in some organizations, right? Some people are just, that's just not their thing. But yes. I love the fact that all of you have seen great success. You all have very different audiences, but when you bring in that level of fun and make the experience something that people want to do, especially when it's a lot of information that they need to absorb. So thank you all for sharing that. That's really great information. And I'm sure the audience can, go back and take that information to their team. If you haven't thought about using games, or you're worried that people are going to think games are too childish or kitschy, we can hear from our three audiences, our three panelists here, that they all have different audiences, and these audiences are not, just 15-year-old boys, right? So Okay, great. Well, I think we touched on this. I mean, if there's any, you've all shared feedback about these programs. If there's any other data or analytics you want to share, that would be, it would be a great time to do that now. If you feel like you've already shared enough, that's fine. So would any of you like to share anything else in terms of any, any specific data?
I can share real quick. I do surveys throughout the onboarding process, and overall the training arcade is rated a 4.24 stars out of 5 with the employees, which is super high. And I think it's going to only get better from here. And that was out of 160 employees. So that is pretty solid.
Totally solid. That's amazing. Thank you for sharing that, Trisha.
Absolutely.
Anyone else, Laura? Nope. All right. You guys shared a lot, so I really appreciate that. All right. Now, we kind of touched on this too, but I was curious if anyone has a preference. I do hear a lot of people take a more blended approach when they're doing things, right? Sometimes there's an appetite for putting things into your learning management system and letting people take on those activities on their own time. Other times, you're in a meeting, whether it's in person or virtual, and it's a great opportunity to get people together. But have you heard, is there one way that you think is better than another, or do you think kind of mixing things up is a better option? Todd?
Yeah, I definitely think mixing things up is definitely the right option to go for. In terms of our preference, I mean, when you use something like Jeopardy or Wheel of Fortune, right? Those are ILT initiated type games that we use. Scenarios are definitely games we use for really in the work, learning the flow of work, understanding how people are applying some of these skills, whether it's emotional intelligence or something else that we're trying to work on. So I think it's a blended approach, Jaime, and the way we look at it. Again, it depends on the journey. It depends on the group of leaders. But I think the beautiful thing about the game agency and the arcades is the ability to build out a multitude of different games for different situations and different platforms.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's definitely a goal. As we continue to think through the game types that make sense to add to our library, we're always thinking like, what would this type of game be used for? So we definitely have some games that are perfect for knowledge retention, assessment checks, and then others that are more immersive, like you said, with like scenarios and detective. Yeah. How about you, Laura?
I'm definitely a blended approach. So for example, during our MSL skills training, we call it CORE for competence and readiness. The MSLs across therapeutic area teams have a pretty rigorous onboarding schedule just to learn their therapeutic area content. So ranging from like 7 weeks for CVR to 12 or more for some of the oncology teams. And so they have to learn all the scientific knowledge, and then we're trying to reinforce their skills training. So we actually developed a digital portal with some, digital content on there. It's about 5.5 hours of training that we ask them to space out during their onboarding. But then we have like 2 half days of application-based workshops. Again, so I'm using the game agency to pull that content through after the workshops. And then my next improvement for our training is to build in some of the games into our workshops as well. So when we do the compliance training, for example, I'll build in that as one of the quiz apps or trivia or something like that. So definitely a blended approach.
Awesome. Trisha, do you agree with that?
I do agree with that. We definitely do a blended approach, and it's highly effective. It's good to like mix the media up like that, do instructor led, have, them doing their self-paced thing. My training is completely virtual. I don't know if I mentioned that. And one other cool thing about the training arcade is that you can create player lists. So you can kind of group people to have different things on their arcades, which is like super important because I have different job titles within this arcade. So some people would see one journey and then the other people might have a different journey within the same arcade. So they're all still competing together.
Fantastic. So I'm going to just take a pause for a second and ask Stephanie how we're doing on timing. Are there any questions that you think that we should be addressing at this moment? I mean, there's plenty more questions I can ask for our panelists, but just wanted to get time check.
We are kind of getting to the end of the time, and that was actually perfect because I was about to interrupt you and say, Jaime, we got to get to these audience questions.
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. So we've had several people ask this actually. The games in the training arcade, can they be exported to SCORM? Can you use it in your LMS? What kind of analytics? If you export it and put it in your LMS, do you still get the same analytics? If you use just like the direct URL to the game, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we designed the platform, we wanted you to be able to collect the same amount of data no matter how you're deploying a game. So if you put a game into your LMS as a SCORM package, you're going to get the same amount of data as you would if you sent out a link to a game, or you embedded the game into a course, or you used a game in an ILT training. The typical SCORM data, which is pretty limited, like that, well, the typical SCORM data that most companies collect with SCORM, high score, level of completion, those kind of things, those will appear directly into your LMS if you download the game as SCORM. But that doesn't mean that that's all the data you're getting, because we're still capturing all the additional rich information that you would if you deployed it as a link or any other way. You would just have to log into your account inside the training arcade to find that data, or we have APIs where you can gather it. So no matter how you deploy, same amount of data. Hopefully that helped answer.
Yes, that is great. A lot of people wanted to know that. So thank you so much.
Yeah.
And then this question, it would be more for our panelists. How do you decide, is there like a specific circumstance when you might want to use a game versus just adding some gamification elements? Do you have any like guidelines for how you would decide to use one versus the other?
Does anybody want to take that?
I know we're springing these on you.
I can go. So for me, specifically, I kind of think about what do I want them to retain it, or do I want them to like perform an action? So if I want them to just complete something, for example, signing up for a badge, I just need them to read the directions and do it. So that's kind of like more of like a PDF style that they get in the training arcade. But like as far as maybe benefits or something like that, then I want them to retain that information. I want them to know how that process works. So then that's when I include a game.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Perfect.
Yeah, thank you. And then, so you all said you've had a great response to the games from your learners. We have a question from Cassandra. Do you feel like you need to already have a strong learning culture in your organization for games to work? She mentioned that they indicate their experience is that you need to have a really good understanding of the learning culture, and that helps determine how adventurous you can be with your different types of learning. Have you had that same experience?
Yeah, I'll take that one, and Trish and Laura can add on. But from my experience, we started slowly with games and gamification. I was working with leaders from a first, second line standpoint, and second line leaders sometimes feel like, I'm not playing a game to learn or for you to test my knowledge. But once they got into it, and I think people talked about the competition and the camaraderie around these games, and watching their managers engage as well, their first line leaders who reported to them, it started a community of learning that wasn't there before. So I do think if you start with games slowly, you slowly purse them out, then you're going to start to see people engaging with them. And it's really choosing the right games. And I think to all of us, the game agency has so many different games you can use, but it's really based on what you want to do. So we started with scenarios, and scenarios was a logic-driven game, and people enjoyed that because it was testing their business acumen and leadership skills. And so they felt that was a higher level game instead of starting with something maybe like Jeopardy, a Wheel of Fortune. So I think it's just the way you choose the game. But I think you can start by using games that will definitely help drive a learning culture within your organization. And I'll let Trisha and Laura expound on that if they'd like.
Yeah, I would totally agree. We have a very strong learning and development team, commercial and medical affairs, but I definitely think it's enhanced our training initiatives. For example, the national business meeting, right? The commercial team, for example, had a totally new visual aid that was really long with some core pages, but overall, like 24 pages and all this data and fair balance and how to answer questions. And so presenting all that information in a live workshop was great, but that's a busy time and they took in a lot of knowledge. So then coming back and pulling that through with the games and the training arcade, and I'll just go back to the metrics that my commercial colleagues had. Just, we started with a fairly high level of proficiency, like, 80%, but to increase that by 10% to me it's a very positive outcome. And then to be able to look specifically by learner or team or, area of the country, how people performed, it really helps coaching as well for their managers. And it helps us in L&D, again, know what to focus on moving forward to reinforce their knowledge.
I would also add that, like, don't think it's going to be perfect. Like, that's kind of how I went into it, thinking like, okay, I need this to be perfect before I roll it out. And it didn't need to be perfect. I started really small, like I kind of broke it up. And they had no idea that this wasn't a perfect ending, right? Like that there was going to be more. It's completely editable, and I just might have made up a word, but it's okay. So yeah, it's okay to not have the perfect plan rolled out, but start small for sure. I highly recommend that.
And I would just add to that as well, sometimes when we are at, let's say ATD or DevLearn or one of these other learning and development conferences, we'll often have games that we have people come by the booth and play. And there's hesitancy occasionally. You've got people come by who are like, well, I don't really know that topic and I'm not really good at playing games, but we encourage them. It's okay. Nobody's going to criticize you if you get that question wrong. Just come over here and have fun. And they ultimately walk away saying, wow, that was so much more fun than I expected. And they kind of forget the fact that they're actually, learning something. They're just immersed in something that's a fun experience. So I do think that if you haven't tried games yet, starting slow, like Trisha was saying, just to introduce it and picking the right game, because there are games that appear to be gamier than others. And so if you're talking about a game like Scenarios, for example, it's really about choices. It's not really a gamey game like you would find in an app store. So think about your audience, who they are, and what you might want to ease them into that kind of experience.
That is a great segue, Jaime, into this other question that we have, which is, all three of you are in the life and health sciences area. Do you feel like the medical community gravitates to one particular type of game over another? I know, Todd, you mentioned that you use Scenarios a lot. What do the three of you think about that question?
Yeah, so I mean, Laura, I think we'll have a really good insights into this as well. But for us, Scenarios, because it was a decision-making, branching logic type game, they enjoyed that. But I would say people really love Jeopardy and Wheel of Fortune in a very, on online when we were doing a lot of virtual training where you're just checking knowledge and want to break up the training a little bit. I didn't see people who disengaged with any of these games that we use. They definitely do, like, from a science standpoint and from a leadership standpoint, the Scenarios or detective games, because it was asking them questions and making them think, and we could see how they were thinking, their decision process and the choices they made, and then how we could help them respond more effectively in the future. So I don't know if in one game mattered over the others, but I just think we tended, from a leadership standpoint, love the Scenarios or detective games because it gave us insights in how they were thinking, their decision process, and how they understood the scenario or situation. And that gave us insights into the way they chose, the path that they chose, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I kind of went all over the board and went kind of game crazy. I wanted to test all the games out and like just throw them all out there. I will say, because Jeopardy, you can do instructor led. And I'm not sure if others, you're able to do that, because I've only tested it with Jeopardy. I can hear the live feedback coming in, right? Like, oh, this is, we're engaging, we're having fun. Whereas the other games, I can't really hear it, but like nobody complains about it. They just say that it's fun. And so I kind of use all the games for sure.
Yeah,
And from
that's
my perspective, oh, sorry.
no, go ahead, Laura. Go
You
ahead.
know, having the medical affairs liaison audience, our CVR MSLs love Jeopardy. You know, it was fun. We got the information across. We saw how they responded and knew where we needed to reinforce knowledge, but they really were engaged. And I think it was novel for them in a way to actually have training that was fun for a change and not just, you know, delivering slides and a lot of scientific content without really pulling it through. And I'm also really looking forward to scenarios. I said that's my next step that I'm going to try with our compliance training scenarios. And then we have another launch coming up in the next year. So I'm going to try to also use that in some of our pre-training for that new pharmacology content, and then just learning the disease state as well.